Her father-in-law threatened to take her children unless she remarried. I called his bluff. I didn't go to the Alderman farm that afternoon looking for a fight. I went because I had 6 yards of fence wire I'd promised to drop off before the first freeze, and because a man who makes a promise to a neighbor keeps it, regardless of what else is happening in his life. I tied my horse at the gate, pulled the wire from the saddlebag, and heard the voices before I even made it to the porch steps. I've been in enough rooms where something wrong was happening to know the sound of it from the outside. There's a particular quality to a conversation where one person is afraid and the other one knows it. I stood at the base of those steps and listened, and what I heard in about 30 seconds made me set that wire down very carefully against the gate post, because I didn't want to be holding anything in my hands when I walked through that door. Let me tell you about Clara first, because she deserves to be introduced properly before I tell you what her father-in-law was doing to her in that kitchen. I'd known Clara Alderman for going on 7 years, since she came out to the Montana Territory as a bride of 22, married to Robert Alderman, who was as decent a man as I've met in all my years ranching. Robert died the previous spring. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of story that gives a man's death a shape that's easy to hold. He fell from a hay wagon and hit his head on the frozen ground, and he was gone before the doctor reached us. And that was all. Clara was left with their farm, 90 acres of good Montana land along the creek, a milk cow, a small herd of cattle, and 3 children, a daughter of 11 named Ruth, a boy of 9 named James, and the youngest, a girl called Lily, who had just turned 5 and still sometimes went to the door when she heard a horse, thinking it might be her father coming home. Clara had kept that farm running from March through November without asking for anything she couldn't ask for with her chin level. That's a fact, not a kindness. I know, because I was her nearest neighbor, a mile and a half east, and I paid attention the way you pay attention to people you respect. What I hadn't known until that afternoon was that Robert's father, a man named Harlan Alderman, had been circling since August. Harlan Alderman was 61 years old and had opinions the way some men have furniture, so much of it arranged so permanently that there was no room left to move. He'd ranched 30 miles north his whole life, built something substantial, and made the mistake that a certain kind of successful man always makes, which is concluding that his success was proof of his judgment rather than proof of his luck and his willingness to work hard in a time when land was cheap and water was free. He had, I learned that afternoon, decided that Clara was not a suitable woman to be raising his grandchildren alone. She was managing fine, he told her, for a woman. But winter was coming. The farm had debt on it, a small note Robert had taken out the spring before he died, against a calf crop that never paid what it should have. And a woman alone, with 3 children and a debt and no husband, was not what Harlan Alderman considered stable. What he considered stable, he had made clear to her, was a man he knew, a widower from his county, 50 years old, prosperous, respectable, a man who would take the children on and give them a proper household. What he had told Clara standing in her own kitchen on that cold November afternoon was that she had until Christmas to agree to the arrangement, or he would go to the territorial court and file for custody of all 3 children on the grounds of her inability to provide. I came through that door in time to hear the last of it, in time to see Clara standing at her kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface, the way a person stands when they are working very hard to keep something inside themselves from coming out in a way they'll regret. Harlan was across from her, his hat on, his coat on, as if he'd never intended to stay long enough to take them off. Ruth had her arms around Lily in the doorway to the back room. James was nowhere that I could see. Harlan looked at me when I came in. He had the eyes of a man who was accustomed to being the largest presence in whatever room he occupied. "This is a family matter," he said. "I know," I said. "I came in anyway." He took my measure, the way men like him take the measure of men like me, quickly, with the assumption that the calculation would conclude in his favor. I was 34, a working rancher with calloused hands and no particular standing in the territory beyond my reputation for doing what I said I'd do. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a judge. I wasn't kin. What I was, though, was a man who had spent 6 years watching Clara Alderman raise crops and children on land that asked everything of her and gave back only what she earned from it. And I was a man who had helped Robert Alderman file his papers at the land office 3 years prior, and who had read at Robert's request every document that bore the Alderman name before Robert put his signature on it. Because Robert was a proud man who trusted his instincts on cattle and his neighbor's eyes on paperwork. I was also, and this is the part that mattered that afternoon, a man who had noticed something in those papers that Robert had glossed over as a formality and that Harlan had apparently forgotten about entirely, or perhaps hoped that everyone else had. "Mr. Alderman," I said, and I kept my voice as flat and even as I could manage, because I've learned over the years that a quiet voice in a tense room does more work than a loud one. I was present when Robert filed the land deed on this property. I read the terms of the note he took out in March. I have a copy of both documents because Robert asked me to keep one. Harlan's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something recalculated. Robert's note, I continued, was co-guaranteed by you. Your signature is on that paper alongside his, which means the debt this farm carries is not Clara's debt alone. It is equally yours, which means if you take this to a territorial court, the court is not going to be looking only at whether Clara can manage 90 acres. It is going to be looking at why a man co-signed a debt on his son's land and then used that same debt as a reason to threaten his daughter-in-law with losing her children. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was moving through the dry grass the way it does in Montana in November, low and constant, and without any particular interest in what happens to the people living in it. "You're bluffing," Harlan said. "I'm not," I said. "And you know I'm not, because you signed it yourself." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara, who had not moved from her position at the table, hands still flat on the surface. Something passed across his face that I couldn't entirely read. Not shame, exactly. More like a man discovering that a door he thought he'd locked had been standing open the whole time. He put his hat more firmly on his head, turned, and walked out. I didn't follow him. I listened to his boots on the porch steps, his horse leaving the yard, the sound of hooves fading down the road toward the north. Then I looked at Clara. She was still standing with her hands on the table. Her face had the expression of someone who has been braced for a blow and is slowly understanding that it isn't coming. "The co-signature," she said finally. "Is that true?" "It is," I said. "Robert showed me the papers the day he signed them." He wanted another set of eyes before he committed to anything. Harlan co-signed because the bank required it. Robert didn't have sufficient collateral on his own yet. I don't think Harlan believed it would ever matter. He thought he could use the debt as a weapon, Clara said. It wasn't a question. He thought no one else would know the shape of it, I said. He was wrong about that. She sat down then, slowly, the way a person sits when their legs have been holding something heavy for longer than they realized. Ruth came out of the back room with Lily still attached to her side, and Clara opened her arms without looking up, and they came to her. And I looked out the kitchen window at the November sky over the Alderman farm and gave them a moment that wasn't mine to be part of. I found James outside, in the barn, doing what 9-year-old boys sometimes do when they are frightened and too proud to show it in front of their family, occupying themselves with something mechanical that requires full attention and gives them permission not to feel what they're feeling. He was mending a broken harness strap with more concentration than the work strictly required. I sat on a hay bale nearby and didn't say anything for a while. After a few minutes, he looked up. Did he leave? He left, I said. Is he coming back? I considered that question the way it deserved to be considered, which is to say, seriously, without offering the boy a comfort I couldn't stand behind. I don't think so, I said. Not with what he came here to do today. James looked back at the harness. His hands were steady, which told me something about the kind of boy he was going to be. He said our mother couldn't take care of us, James said. He said it the way children sometimes report terrible things they've heard, in a voice that is trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. What do you think? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. She fixed the well pump herself last July, he said. In the rain. She did, I said. I saw it. I think he's wrong, James said, and went back to the harness. I stayed for supper that evening, which Clara made from what she had in the kitchen, and which was better than most meals I'd cooked myself that week. We didn't talk about Harlan at the table. Clara talked about the cattle and the state of the south pasture, and what she thought about the coming winter's feed situation. And I answered, and the children ate, and the lamp burned, and outside the wind moved through the November grass. After the children were in bed, Claire and I sat at the table and talked plainly about the practical situation, the note, the debt, the options available to her if Harlan chose to push the matter further despite what I'd told him. I explained every piece of it as clearly as I could. She asked good questions, the kind that showed she'd already been thinking about the problem from several angles and simply needed more information to think it through to the end. Before I left, she said, "You didn't have to stay." "I know," I said. "You didn't have to come in at all. You could have left the wire at the gate." "I could have," I agreed. She looked at me then with a particular directness she had, a quality I'd noticed in her since the first year we were neighbors, but had been careful not to examine too closely, out of respect for what was right while Robert was alive, and out of respect for her grief in the year after he wasn't. "Why didn't you?" she asked. I picked up my hat from where I'd set it on the table. I'd been thinking about how to answer that question honestly for the better part of the last 3 hours. "Because some things are wrong," I said, "and a man who knows they're wrong and walks away anyway has to live with that. I've done it before. I didn't want to do it again." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was accepting something as true and filing it where it belonged. I went home. I didn't sleep particularly well. Harlan Alderman did not return to that farm before Christmas. He did not file any papers in the territorial court, whether it was the co-signature that stopped him, or simply the realization that his plan had been seen clearly and named out loud by a witness who wasn't going to forget it. I couldn't say for certain. Probably both. Men like Harlan are not usually deterred by morality alone. They are deterred by math. There were people in the county who had opinions about what happened, because there always are. A few of them thought Clara should have taken the widower up north regardless, for the children's sake. A few of them thought Harlan had been within his rights as a grandfather to concern himself. Martha Pruitt at the dry goods store told me directly, in the tone people use when they think they're doing you a kindness, that a woman in Clara's position needed more than a neighbor's protection, that she needed a husband. I told Martha that Clara seemed to be doing fine on her current arrangement and left it at that. What I didn't tell Martha or anyone else that winter was that things had shifted between Clara and me in a way I hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure what to do with. We had always been neighbors. We had become, through that November afternoon and the evenings that followed it, something closer to friends. The kind of friendship that forms between two people who have shown each other something true about themselves and decided that what they saw was worth staying near. By February, I was finding reasons to ride past the Alderman farm more often than the fence line or the cattle strictly required. By March, I stopped pretending those reasons were about the fence or the cattle. I asked Clara on a Wednesday morning in early spring with the creek running high and the first green showing in the low pasture if she would be willing to take supper with me in town on Saturday, not as a matter of neighborly concern, but as something plainly different from that. She looked at me in the straightforward way she had. "I was wondering when you were going to ask," she said. We were married in June, quiet and without ceremony that required a lot of preparation, because neither of us was a person who needed much ceremony to know when something was real. James stood beside me at the front of the church in a jacket that was slightly too short in the sleeves because he'd grown 2 inches since October, and nobody had quite caught up with it yet. Ruth held Lily's hand through the whole thing with the seriousness of an 11-year-old who understands that certain moments require her full attention. Lily fell asleep in Ruth's arms before it was over and had to be told about it afterward, which she accepted with the equanimity of a 5-year-old who has decided that the world is generally going to work out. Harlan Alderman sent a letter. It was brief and not particularly warm, but it was not hostile either, which I considered about the best available outcome and accepted accordingly. The children continued to see him twice a year, at Christmas and in summer, which was right and proper because he was their grandfather and his failings were his failings, not theirs to carry. There is a pair of work gloves sitting on the shelf by the barn door now that have been there for 3 years. They were Robert's. Clara put them there in the first week after he died, and they've stayed, and no one has moved them, and no one is going to. A home that has been built on loss doesn't have to pretend the loss didn't happen. It only has to be large enough to hold what came before and what came after. Both. I think about that November afternoon sometimes, about the wire I set against the gatepost before I walked through the door, about a man who thought the shape of a debt was his private knowledge, about a woman with her hands flat on a table, holding something in, and 3 children who needed someone to be steady. I was steady. I am still steady. That is, as far as I can account for it, the whole of what I did that mattered. The rest was just staying.